Welcome to episode 109 of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I'm actually Scott Myers, screenwriter and blogger over at sellingyourscreenplay.com. Today I'm interviewing Thunder Levin, the writer of the Sharknado movies. He's very candid and has a great story to share. He worked in and out of the industry for many, many years and finally was able to break in after more than a decade of trying. We talk about how he broke in. We talk about how he eventually got hired to write Sharknado and what he's been working on since that broke. So stay tuned for that. If you find this episode valuable, please help me out by giving me a review in iTunes or leaving a comment on YouTube or retweeting the podcast on Twitter or liking it on Facebook. These social media shares really do help spread word about the podcast, so they're very much appreciated. Couple of quick notes. Any websites or links that I mention in the podcast can be found on my blog in the show notes. I also publish a transcript with every episode in case you'd rather read the show or look at something later on. You can find all the podcast show notes at www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/podcasts, and then just look for episode number 109. I continually build out the SYS script library. Lots of people have been sending in scripts. Thank you to all of those. This past week, Ryan Phillips sent in Trainwreck, 48 Hours, The Incredible Hulk, Harlem Nights, and Hall Pass. Thank you, Ryan, for sending those in. So those are now available on the SYS at the SYS script library. Thank you, Tim Teets, for sending in Inside Out and The Diary of a Teenage Girl, and he also sent in Trainwreck too, coincidentally the same week that Ryan did. So all those scripts are now available in the SYS script library. If you have a screenplay that you do not see listed in the script library, please do email them to me. The SYS script library is a completely free service. There's thousands of scripts. They're all in PDF format, so you can read them on whatever device you want, and they're easy to download. You just go to the SYS script library. There's a nice little index page where you can find the scripts alphabetized. You click on them. You click on the link to the PDF, and then it should pop up. Again, you should be able to go to this in your iPhone, your iPad, any of your mobile devices, and then just click through and get the PDF, and it should pop up and be fairly easy to read on any of these mobile devices. So check that out. And as I said, thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Tim, for sending this in. The library builds. I mean, obviously I do get scripts myself and I do add those to the library, but as a group effort, it's great because obviously there's probably lots of scripts that people have in their possession that maybe I don't have for whatever reason. So if you have a script, you see that it's not listed on the SYS script library, please do email it in to me and we will post it for everybody to download. If you want my free guide, How to Sell a Screenplay in 5 Weeks, you can pick that up by going to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. It's completely free. You just put in your email address and I'll send you a new lesson once per week for 5 weeks, along with a bunch of bonus lessons. I teach the whole process of how to sell a screenplay in that guide: how to write a professional logline and query letter, how to find agents, managers, and producers who are looking for material. Really is everything you need to know to sell your screenplay. Just go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. Quick few words about what I'm working on. Obviously, the big thing I'm working on right now is my Kickstarter campaign. As you listen to this podcast episode, I'm probably a little more than halfway through the campaign. This episode is being published on February 1st, and the campaign runs until 5 p.m. on February 16th, so a little more than 2 weeks. I've been doing mini podcast episodes with Kickstarter updates, so look for that on either Wednesday or Thursday of this week. These are easier for me to publish quickly, so I can give more of a real-time update. As I mentioned before, I'm recording this almost a full week before it publishes, so if I were to give an update, by the time you listen to it, it would be already sort of outdated because the Kickstarter campaign is very dynamic. I'm changing things. People are giving donations. Certain rewards are being taken up. So these mini podcast episode Kickstarter updates I think are working pretty well. And as I said, I can basically record a 5 or 10 minute update and I can publish it, within 15 minutes of recording it. So they're much more in real time. So keep an eye out for those. I've been doing those on Wednesdays or Thursdays of each week. Overall, I think the campaign is going pretty well. If you haven't already checked out the page, my Kickstarter page, please do check it out. Even if it's just to read the screenplay is available there. No contribution necessary. Anyone can just click it and download it. And as I've mentioned before, I did shoot a nice little 1-minute teaser trailer. You can watch that on the Kickstarter page. So please do just check it out. If you like the page and you think it looks cool, please do pass it along to your friends and family. Share it via social media. If you see some of my tweets or see some of my Facebook posts about the Kickstarter campaign, screenplay, please do like them. Just liking them on Facebook, it really does snowball. And I can tell every week I'll do a post like for the podcast or whatever I post to the Selling Your Screenplay Facebook page. And, if nobody likes, for whatever reason, nobody likes that particular post that week, Facebook will tell you how many people have actually like viewed it or it was shown to. And, there's almost 3,000 likes on the Selling Your Screenplay Facebook page, and if I just do a post and nobody likes it, I'll get like 28 people will actually view the post. If I get even like 3 likes, that number might shoot up to 300, 400, 500 people will actually see that post. So these likes really are important to spread the word. Facebook uses that as part of their algorithm to continue to show it. If nobody likes the post, they just figure we're not going to show this because nobody's liking it. If people click that like button, it doesn't take but a fraction of a second to just click that like button, and so it does help. My point to all that is it really does help, and I can definitely tell when people like it, and even better, comment on it. That sort of just keeps that ball rolling, and it can snowball on Facebook. So if you're already doing that, I really do appreciate it. Thank you very much for those likes. So the other big thing I'm working on, and I mentioned this a little bit, is my TV pilot. It takes place in the Southern California music scene in the early 60s. I started actually writing pages last week, so I think I just sort of broke onto the sixth page as I ended on Friday. As I said, I'm recording this on a Monday, so as I ended on Friday, I got to around page 6. It's a half-hour show, so it'll probably be 25 to 30 pages. So I don't think I'll get a draft done this week, but probably next week I'll have a draft done. Maybe I'll do 10 pages. What would that get me? Yeah, that would get me about there. I already have 6 pages, so I do 10 pages this week and 10 pages next week. That will get me to the 26 pages, and that's probably about where I'll be. So hopefully by the end of next week, I'll have a draft of that done. And then, as I said, I'm working on that with another producer writer, and so he may take a pass at this script too. But this will be kind of the first rough draft, and hopefully we can get that going quickly. So that's what I'm working on screenwriting wise. Now let's get into the main segment. Today I'm interviewing Thunder Levin. Again, he's the writer of all the Sharknado scripts. So here is the interview. Welcome, Thunder, to the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Ashley.
So to start out, maybe we can just go all the way back to the beginning, and kind of you can give us some insight into how you got started in your career, and even before that, how you became interested in film and being a screenwriter and filmmaker.
Oh, my gosh. I was going to say something clever about in the beginning there was darkness. Let's see. For me, it probably goes all the way back to when I was a little kid, growing up watching the original Star Trek.
Huh.
I've told this story before, but when I was very little, I was like, 5 maybe. Star Trek was my favorite TV show.
Uh-huh.
And it was the one show my mother would let me stay up late to watch. And I wanted to be Mr. Spock or Captain Kirk. But I was just old enough to understand that this wasn't real, and I couldn't really, fly around and have adventures on the Enterprise. And at the same time on the news, the Apollo moon landing was going on, and I saw how primitive the real space travel was. And that didn't appeal to me. And so I went back to what I wanted to be when I was 2 or 3, which was the guy who drove the back of the hook and ladder fire truck. And then a friend of my parents, gave me a book called The Making of Star Trek.
Huh.
And it was a very dry, behind the scenes book written for adults. So the first thing I did as a little 5-year-old or whatever was to turn to the photo section. And the very first picture in The Making of Star Trek is a shot of these studio technicians in their 1960s work clothes standing on the bridge of the Enterprise. And I think something clicked in my little child brain that said there is a way I can work on the Enterprise.
Huh.
And I think that's where it all started. And then in high school, I took a TV production class, and I worked in theater a lot. And I went to see Star Wars one day, and everything kind of changed.
Uh-huh.
movies up until then had been very serious. It was the time of Scorsese and Coppola, and everybody had a statement, and didn't particularly appeal to teenage me.
Uh-huh.
And then I saw Star Wars, and I realized you could have fun at the movies.
Huh. So then take us through, okay, so you're interested in filmmaking, you love movies. What were the first steps to actually fulfilling that dream?
Well, like I said, I took a TV production class in high school, and then me and a couple of friends did an independent study where we created an hour-long Star Trek spoof. And we did it on our own after class, and it was a real honest-to-God TV production, on very primitive black and white reel-to-reel videotape, which we could hardly edit, and that gave me a taste for it. That was a great experience. It was called Star Wreck, the videotape, and in addition to helping in production and writing and directing. I didn't write and direct it. I helped contribute to that. It was sort of a group effort, but I also played Mr. Croc. So that was kind of my childhood dream come true. I got to be Spock. So that was a great teaser to it, sort of. And then I did a lot of theater in high school and college, musical theater. And then it was time to go to college, and what am I going to major in? The obvious thing was film. And so I went to film school at NYU, and I made a student film, and I took it to Hollywood, and I said, Mr. Spielberg, here I am. And I never actually got to Mr. Spielberg. I didn't get even to the receptionist, because you walk into Amblin and a security guard intercepts you before you can even talk to the receptionist.
And did you actually try that, to walk in there and meet him?
Yeah. Actually, I was a PA on a shoot on the Universal lot, and on our lunch break, I walked into Amblin. But I did get the name. They didn't really let me get anywhere. I mean, maybe I got 3 steps past the door. But I did get the name of the director of development, and so I sent her my student film, and she sent me back a very nice letter saying, good for you, keep it up, but basically, go away. And then I just started sort of making the rounds. I worked for Roger Corman on several movies, and I just started knocking on doors and sending my student film to anybody who would look at it. And everybody, and then anybody who was anywhere in the business, I'd ask them for advice. And the most common thing was, well, if you want to direct, write a script that somebody wants to produce and attach yourself. So I started writing.
So that was your first, up until this point, though, you were not necessarily interested in being a writer. You were more interested in being a director?
I was and am a director first and foremost.
Okay.
Writing is something... writing is still a job for me. I enjoy it. It's probably the only thing besides directing that I could do to make a living that wouldn't drive me insane. But my first passion is directing. Now, best of all is writing and directing, because then you really are the creator of that movie or that TV show.
So let's dig into your Roger Corman experience.
Yep.
I get a lot of people sending me emails just asking, like, hey, how can I break in? How can I get that first job? Maybe you can describe to us just exactly how you got on just even those first production assistant jobs, because I think that might be helpful for people just to hear just exactly what happened.
Well, the very first PA job I had was actually in New York before I moved to L.A., and that was through school. Things were posted on the bulletin board in the film school when low-budget films needed PAs and stuff, needed help. And so if you're in film school, there are usually resources you can take advantage of to get entry-level work. When I came out here, I had a friend who knew some people, And I called some of my professors from NYU and asked them if they could put me in touch with people. So, I mean, networking is really, you hear this all the time, but networking is the most important thing, and you never know who's going to know somebody. So really ask everybody, because even, your plumber might have a cousin whose friend works for somebody who's an assistant to somebody. And maybe you can get a phone number or a name and make a call, and then it's up to you to make an impression.
Yeah.
But it's that first foot in the door. The way it worked for me at Corman's was that a friend of mine who I knew from film school and was a year ahead of me had been out here, and somehow his student film had been seen by somebody at Corman. And they called him in for a meeting and had him pitch something. And that sort of reminded me that Roger Corman existed. And so he told me the name of the person that he had met with. He wasn't in any position to refer me, but he told me who the guy's name was. So then I called up and asked to speak with him. And I don't remember... I guess I got a meeting, or maybe I sent them my student film, and they were looking for somebody to be a runner for the office, to just run errands and stuff. Mm-hmm. And so I took that job, and and then my girlfriend at the time, I'd been on the job like a week or two, and they were looking for a new receptionist, and so I recommended my girlfriend, and she got that job. And then I left that job because I got a PA job through another school connection. And when that was over, my girlfriend was now production supervisor at Corman's studio. And so she got her boss to hire me as a still photographer. And that's how I started getting on set. Still photographer, if you're any good at it, is the best job on a film to learn how a film crew functions, because your sole job is to watch what's going on. And so I was on three or four films for them as still photographer. And it was a great education. I learned more about how movies are physically actually made doing that than in most of my classes in film school.
Yeah.
And so all during that time, of course, I was trying to meet people there, and I was in the office, and so I'd get to know the director of development, and I said, hey, can I pitch you a story, or can you watch my student film? And he said, sure, pitch me a story, and I pitched him a story, and he said, okay, write it up. And so I wrote up a detailed outline, and he said, well, that's pretty cool. Why don't you write the script? Not that he was going to pay me for it. I wasn't Guild, so you could actually tell me, if you want to submit a spec script, go ahead.
Uh-huh.
And so I wrote a spec script, and I submitted it to them, and they didn't buy it. But now I had a script in my hand, and so I was able to start sending that out. And a producer, how did that happen? And so then one day I made a cold call. Die Hard had just come out, and I thought this was a great movie. And I remembered Predator being a great movie, and so I was really impressed by John McTiernan, who directed him. Mm-hmm. And so I just cold called his office. Said, I'm a graduate of the NYU Film School. I'm trying to break into the business. I'd love if you would talk to me or meet with me or watch my student film. And so I got as far as his assistant. I never actually spoke to John McTiernan. But his assistant said, sure, send me your student film. And so I sent it, and she liked it. And we met, and we ended up becoming sort of friends, and we talked. And she was like, well, look, there's, the script that you've written, it's not bad, but it's not right for McTiernan. But one of the guys who produced his early movies might be interested. And so she put me in touch with him. And he called me in for a meeting, and he liked what he saw, but not enough to make it. But he said he'd keep me in mind. And so then a year later, a friend of mine had written a script, and I submitted that to him, and he said, yeah, we can do this. And so I was hired to direct it, and then that whole thing blew up. But it was step by step, these little things, just knocking on doors, making cold calls, networking, taking advantage of every little opportunity that sort of got me in the business.
Did you have other scripts, like you're pitching this, you wrote this one script for Roger Corman, they didn't buy it, and you started to pitch it to other people. At this point, did you say, well, maybe I could write some other scripts? Did you
eventually,
just continue?
Yeah. When that didn't sell, and when the one that sold that I was directing went sideways, sort of, and basically the producer and I didn't get along, and he ended up taking over the production. And I don't know, in my naivete, I was still pretty young, and in my naivete, I thought the producer was there to help realize my vision, and it turned out he was there for himself. And so I actually ended up leaving that production. And so after that, yeah, I started writing new scripts and submitting them everywhere. And of course, I'd still go back to Roger Corman, and he had another company that he sometimes co-produced with, and so I sent things to them. And so people started to get to know me. I wasn't actually selling a script. The key to my success is that I was a failure for 20 years. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. But I never gave up. I mean, if you really want to know what the key to being the writer of Sharknado was, and of course, you know, who's to say if that's actually a kind of success or not. But the main key to the whole thing was simply that I never gave up.
Yeah. I wonder if I can touch on something. It seems like cold calling has been a big part of your career. You got that first PA job with Roger Corman through cold calling, and then you just cold called John McTiernan's office. Maybe you could give us a couple tips, because I know I've heard from writers that cold calling really does work, but most of us, and I include myself in this, as a writer, I'm sort of timid and not that outgoing, and I don't feel like I would be very good at cold calling. So maybe you can just give us a couple quick tips on how you get the courage to do that and what you actually say.
That's a really good question, because like you, I am incredibly uncomfortable doing things like that. Networking to me is the very worst part of this business. Going to an industry party makes me want to slit my wrist.
Yeah.
But it's a matter of forcing yourself, and I guess being desperate enough. In the beginning, you know, the cold calling, I would basically look at what movies I liked or what movies were being made, you know, in a genre that I thought I might be able to work. And I'd find out what company was behind it, and I'd look up their phone number, and I'd you know, there were production directories and stuff, and you can find out who's the director of development. And if you can't, I would just call the office, and I'd say, hi, can you tell me the name of your director of development? And half the time they'd just connect me to that office, and half the time they'd give me the name, and the other half the time they'd say, why? And then I'd stammer and stumble and say, at that point, you know, when you're young, it's a bit easier because you can go in with this sort of naive, golly gee, well, I just graduated from film school, and I'd like to have so-and-so take a look at my student film. And it's surprised, or I've just graduated from film school and I'd like to have so-and-so read my script. And it's surprising how often they'll just say, okay, send it over. You know, and
when you say surprising, what kind of statistics could you say? Like when you do a cold call, what kind of success rate would you have? Like 20%, 50%?
Well, this was back then, remember, in, say, the late 80s. I think it's probably changed a lot because now everybody wants to be a filmmaker, or at least it seems that way to me. And when I was in film school, it was still kind of an unusual thing for a human being to do, right? I mean, it was unheard of 10 years before. I don't think the average high school kid would ever consider filmmaking as a career until Star Wars, until all the behind-the-scenes publicity from Star Wars. You know, Lucas was as much the star of the Star Wars phenomena as Harrison Ford or Mark Hamill or Carrie Fisher. Mm-hmm. And so I think that started opening people's eyes that filmmaking was actually a real career and not just this magical thing off in Hollywood. But even when I went to film school, it was still an unusual choice. Now I would think people must get bombarded by people like that, and so maybe it's harder than it was. But my recollection is that my success rate of having somebody willing to look at a student film was well over 50%.
Huh.
Now, mind you, I was self-selecting. I mean, I was so timid and I was so afraid of making these calls that I would be very limited in the number of places I actually called. And I would limit them to places that I knew were making the kind of movies I wanted to make. And I'd do my research and try and find out who I needed to talk to. And frequently, one of the tricks I found was that on the first call, when you call up and say, "Hi, who's your director of development?" it was just fact-finding. I wouldn't even ask them to put me through. I'd wait a couple of days, and then I'd call back. And then when I called back, I'd have the person's name. And so I could just very casually say, "Hi, Joe Smith, please." And that would often get you past the first gatekeeper, the receptionist, because it's their job to fend you off, sort of. Yeah. But if you can call up and sound like you know who you're asking for, that can sometimes get you through. Yeah. But once I actually got through to the executive, I found that more often than not, it was probably just easier to say, "Sure, send it over," rather than having to let me down easy or tell me no and be an asshole. Nobody really wants to be an asshole. So it was probably easier. And then, I don't know how many times the actual executive would watch the film. Probably they had some assistant do it. But maybe the assistant liked it and said, "Hey, check this out."
Mm-hmm. And so then the idea was you would get a meeting and you were hoping that they would hire you as a director at this point?
Yeah, that was the idea. It was probably a far-fetched idea, but that was the idea. And I'd get these meetings, and I'd try and go in and make a good impression, and sound like I knew what I was talking about. And sometimes it would turn into a PA job, and sometimes it would turn into if you've got a script someday, let me read it. And sometimes it would be, let's keep talking, and sometimes it would be, thanks for coming in, kid. And then it would just be a matter of following up. Every couple of months I would call them back and just sort of remind them I was alive. And if I had something new for them to look at, I'd ask them to take a look at that. And while this, and eventually I started, once I had scripts, then these were the people that I could send those scripts to. And I got just enough encouragement, just enough positive response to keep going, to not give up, but never actually sold a script. And this went on for years and years, and what I had always promised myself was that at a certain point, if I hadn't been hired as a director or sold a script, that I would make my own film. And so eventually I decided that, it's not happening this way, so I'm going to raise money and make my own feature.
And that was Mutant Vampire Zombies from the Hood?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit. Was this a script that you had around and were circulating to these various contacts?
No.
It was something you just wrote?
There's actually kind of an interesting story behind that, is that one of the people that I had ended up networking to, and this was a connection through a connection through a connection, was a guy named Roger Saunders, who was a filmmaker up in the Bay Area in San Francisco. And he was he was an older guy, and I don't know that he's ever actually done anything, but he was not so much an artist or a writer-director. I mean, he was that too, but he was a wheeler-dealer. He was a guy who wanted to make the deal and make things happen. And so we were talking, and I had sent him some scripts, and he liked them, And he said, look, I'm putting together this financing package for a whole slate of films. We might even be buying this old warehouse in San Francisco, or Oakland, I guess it was, and we're going to turn it into a soundstage. So he had these grand plans, and he was talking to these investors, and he was like, yeah, it's going to happen any day now. And then finally it was like, yeah, we've settled on the deal. We just have to have the contracts written up. Why don't you write me a script for a low-budget urban horror film, and that'll be the first thing we do. So, okay, me and a collaborator that I'd worked with on something else, we sat down and we said, all right, we have to write this low-budget urban horror film. What are we going to do? How can we make it really cheap to shoot and you make it exciting and make it something that this guy will want to produce? And so we sat down, and in 2 weeks we wrote this zombie film that started out in a warehouse. The original idea was the whole thing would take place in the warehouse, and that would be really cheap to shoot. And as we developed it, only the first quarter of it took place in the warehouse. Then we went out onto the streets of L.A., of the hood, as it were. And so I sent it off to Roger Saunders, and he said, I like it. As soon as the deal is done, as soon as the contracts are signed, this will be the first film we'll do. And so I was very excited, and I was going to direct it. And I waited to hear from him, and I checked in, and he said, well, we're still working on the paperwork. And then a few more weeks went by, and I emailed him, and I didn't hear back. I emailed again, I didn't hear back. I called, I got his answering machine, I left a message, called again, left another message. And at this point, I was starting to think he had just flaked out on us, or the deal had fallen through, and he didn't want to admit it. And then I called one more time because I just didn't want to give up, and his wife answered the phone. And, I asked if he was there, and she sadly informed me that he had had a heart attack and died.
Oh, my gosh, that's terrible.
Yeah, and it was he was a big, strong, healthy man. I mean, he might have been 50, but he was in, like, prime shape. He looked like an athlete when you met him in person. And I was just kind of stunned. And apparently he had an undiagnosed heart defect. And one day he just dropped dead. And so I called up my writing partner, George, and I said, we should make this film ourselves because we could die. And he looked at me and he said, you're absolutely right. And we started that day. And we wrote up a business plan, and we started soliciting investors, and we called and wrote to everybody we knew, I mean literally. And I hit up a lot of my father's business associates, and little by little we raised $150,000, and we made a movie. And it was that movie that I was then able to send to my friend David Latt, who was a partner at a company called The Asylum, who had never taken me seriously as a filmmaker. I was always just that friend of his friend who wanted to direct. But whenever I would call him, he would be like, "Yeah, we're not looking for anybody. We're just making films ourselves." Well, yeah. And he would just shine me on, and I think it's just because there was no proof that I could do what I had said I did. Yeah, I'd made a student film 15 years earlier, but what else had I done? Mm-hmm. And so finally, I had this film in hand that I showed him. And it proved that I could make a feature film. And he saw that, and he said, okay, I'll give your name to our director of development, and when we're looking for directors or we're looking for scripts, he'll contact you. And 6 months later, or whatever it was, their director of development finally emailed me and said, hey, we're looking for story pitches on this idea. And I put together a few story pitches for that idea and sent them off, and none of them quite hit. But they weren't, so outer limits that they weren't bad. They fulfilled the objective, and so the next time they needed ideas, he contacted me again. And this time it was something that was really in my wheelhouse. It was a car racing movie. They wanted a knockoff of Fast and the Furious, or Fast and the Furious 5, whatever was about to come out in 6 months, they wanted a knockoff of it. And I'm a car guy, and so I wrote them an illegal street racing script.
And was this something that they paid you to do, or
yeah? Well, I mean, first I had to pitch my story idea.
Yeah.
You know, they had like a one-sentence log line, and they said, pitch us a story idea that fulfills this. Mm-hmm. And so I pitched them, 2 or 3 or 4 story ideas, and they picked one. It was just a 1-paragraph pitch. They picked one and said, okay, give us a 1-page version of this, flesh it out a bit. And so I did, and they liked that, and then what happened? And so then they hired me to write an outline. So based on my 1-page synopsis, they hired me to write a 3 to 4 page outline, and they were going to pay me $500 for that. Mm-hmm. And so I wrote that, and they were like, "Okay, this is good. We're gonna hire you to write the script." And
Can I just go back? I'm sorry. Can I just go back on a couple things with the Mutant Vampire project?
Yep.
I want to ask. Did the movie ever, so it was good enough, it got you this work at the asylum, and that's great, but were you able to make back the money for your investors? Did you enter it into film festivals? Did you get some distribution on it?
We entered into film festivals. We never won anywhere. We got distribution from very small companies. So the film was available on DVD. You could order it on Amazon. It was and still is available on streaming services. It was available on Netflix for a few years, but that whole side of the business is quite the scam. Mm-hmm. And distributors are always allowed to deduct their expenses before they pay you anything. And then once they deduct their expenses, they still get their 20% distribution fee. And by the time they deduct their expenses and their 20% distribution fee, there's basically nothing left. So I will get, from our streaming distributor, we will occasionally get checks for $10, $20 quarterly, $80. I mean, in the beginning, in the first couple of years, we were getting checks for $2,000 or $3,000 when we had our Netflix deal, and it was on some VOD services with cable providers. The film made a few $1,000s in the first year or 2, and then that died off to a trickle. But we've never seen a dime from any of our DVD distribution, and I think we made like $6,000 selling the rights for distribution in the UK. That's about it.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, and the reason I ask is I think it's interesting for aspiring writers, aspiring filmmakers to kind of understand what they're up against. And there is, even though the movie maybe wasn't a financial success, it did get your career going. Yeah. So it has a bunch of value, and people really need to understand this. And Mutant Vampire Zombies from the Hood, it's not a movie that blew up, but yet it did propel your career kind of one step up. And a lot of people are looking to do that, Clerks or Brothers McMullen. Exactly. And I always try and tell them, listen, even if it's not going to blow up like that, it still can have a lot of value in the overall scheme. Obviously, it's not good for the investors, and the investors do need to be informed that this is a risky venture. But for you as a filmmaker, it definitely can propel you on. I'm curious, with $150,000, how did you get C. Thomas Howell attached to the script?
Well, I hired a casting director. I knew a casting director from a previous project that I had tried to get going with another producer, and she had introduced me to this guy, and we became friends. And so he, he was an experienced casting director, and he knew all the agents in town. And there are a lot of actors, who've had some success and had some visibility at some point, but who aren't working constantly at any given moment. Maybe somebody just bought a new house and they need to make the down payment, or they want to buy a new car. So for an actor, who's going to commit, 10, 12, 15 days to one of these low-budget films, if he can make 10, 20 grand in that amount of time, and he's not doing anything else, well, why wouldn't he? What's he got to lose? It's not like it's hard to get the up-and-comers because they don't want to do anything that might look bad on their reel.
Mm-hmm.
But someone like C. Thomas Howell, who's already had a career, what does he care if he works, for 2 weeks for us and makes the money to make his mortgage payment for the next 2 months?
Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to the asylum and just kind of go through. So you had this movie 200 miles per hour, and did things continue to progress like that? They would basically come to you with a log line and say, we want something like this, and then you would pitch them ideas?
The thing about 200 miles per hour is that I went into it thinking I was going to direct it. And there was a miscommunication. To this day, I'm not quite sure how it happened, because David Latt, the partner there, knew me as a director, and when I was talking to the director of development during the pitch process, he knew I was a director. And so I'd actually gotten to the outline stage, and I came in to meet with them when they were going to tell me, okay, go write the script. And I started talking to them about, how we were going to shoot this and when and where and how long I'd have. And all of a sudden they all started looking at each other with these sort of awkward glances. And they said, I think maybe there's been a misunderstanding. We already have a director for this film. And I stopped, and we all just sort of stared at each other for a very awkward moment, and then the conversation continued. But basically, out of that, they said, "Well, look, the next one you'll direct, assuming we like the script you write." And so after 200 miles per hour, and they were happy with the script, and they made the film, and the chief partner's girlfriend at the time said it was her favorite film that company had ever made, and I think that probably stood me in good stead. And so then they came back to me and they said, "Yeah, the next one you'll write and direct." And so they just, as they needed story ideas, they came back to me, and it wasn't much after that they said, "Hey, we need a movie that could be called Battleship, because Universal's coming out with this big Battleship movie based on the game, and so we need a mockbuster of that." I don't know that they actually call them mockbusters, but
yeah.
And it's not a satire. They just want a movie like that they want to ride the marketing coattails, basically. But from an internal standpoint, you're not trying to do a knockoff of someone else's movie. You're just making the best movie you can, on a very tiny budget, on 1/10 of 1% of what the studio is doing the same story, the same concept. And so they said, "All right, give us some pitches for a movie that could be Battleship." And so I came up with some pitches. And again, this was right in my wheelhouse because I'm a sailor from way back. And so I know, I know nautical terminology, and I know the sea, and I know ships, and I have friends in the Navy, and I've been a big fan of Navy movies and stuff like that, and so it all sort of came together, and it was another good choice for me. And actually, during the development process of that movie, I got the best note ever. Normally, you hear these stories about people getting just bizarre script notes during the development process.
Uh-huh.
And we were going back and forth on the treatment for that, and originally the bad guys were North Koreans, and then they didn't want it to be North Koreans. They said make it sort of a non-specific threat, like it's some terrorist organization or it's a James Bond type villain. Don't make it a specific country. So I didn't really like that idea much. It seemed kind of cartoonish and unbelievable that somebody like that could be a real threat to the U.S. Navy. But I went along with it, and we were working on the story, and then finally I said, you know what? Make the bad guys aliens. And it's one of those, I was just writing a naval warfare movie, and all of a sudden they said, make the bad guys aliens, and it was just so funny and so ridiculous that I had to laugh at the absurdity of it. But then when I started thinking about it, it actually made sense. Because what power on earth could really challenge the United States Navy?
Pretty much none, yeah.
Yeah. And so it actually worked that it was aliens, but we thought it was North Korea and China to begin with. Because the aliens were trying to start a war, a world war, so that they didn't have to wipe us out. We would wipe ourselves out, and then they could come in and take over our planet. And so it actually made perfect sense in the end. But it was one of those notes that you get, and you just can't believe somebody saying it.
Yeah. And did you know that the studio version of this was also aliens?
No. In fact, I had intentionally, from the moment I got the assignment, I had intentionally avoided any knowledge of the studio film. All I knew about Battleship while I was writing it, and even while I was making the film, all I knew about Battleship was that Liam Neeson was in it. And I actually didn't find out it had aliens in it until, I think, actually late in production. And then I was like, oh, now I see why they wanted aliens. Yeah. But exactly. By then I already had my own story.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right. Is if you're going to make, there's no one that's even going to come close to beating the American U.S. Navy at this point. So right. They came to the same conclusion that you did. So let's move along on some of these other films and eventually talk about Sharknado. Did you just continue to sort of work this same system? Basically, you would get log lines and then you would pitch them, and they would hire you to write it or hire you to write and direct it?
Yeah, I mean, it was actually American Warships, what the Battleship movie ended up being called, American Warships, that got me Sharknado. I finished American Warships, and in a lot of ways it was the best production they'd ever done there. And they were all very happy with it, at least until Universal started suing people. And my argument is the only reason Universal actually sued over it is because they knew I had a better story than they did. But that's my opinion. I don't know if Universal would admit to that. But they were very happy with it, and they said, okay, what do you want to do next? And, and they said, well, we've got these kind of things coming up. We want to do a giant monster movie, I guess because Pacific Rim was going to be coming out. And I was like, well, yeah, I've always been a Godzilla fan. Maybe a giant monster movie would be okay. And then while I was just sort of thinking on what do I want to do with a giant monster movie, they called me in for a meeting, and they said, look, we've got this idea. It's called Sharkstorm. We think you'd be the guy to do it. And I was like, Sharkstorm? That doesn't sound like anything I would want to do. I mean, haven't we seen enough shark movies? And at the same time, I was feeling a little burned by the American Warships experience, because while I had been trying to do a very realistic, serious action. I mean, it wasn't Shakespeare, but it was a serious attempt at a naval action movie. The visual effects were just laughable, and I had no control over them. Mm-hmm. And so when you watch that film, it comes off as being a lot cheesier than it would have been if my exact film had been made the way it was, but it had really good visual effects. And I was feeling very burned by that. And so I didn't want to do another serious movie that was going to end up being cheesy and tacky. And when they said, we want you to do Sharkstorm, I said, is this going to be played for laughs, or is this going to be a straight movie about sharks in a storm? And they said, no, it's going to be straight. And I was like, no, I don't want to do that, because it'll just look crappy, and people will laugh where they're not supposed to laugh. I don't want to do that. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I was getting into Game of Thrones. I think that was the first year of Game of Thrones. And I was like, you know what I really want to do is I want to create a whole world. I want to do something where I can create a whole civilization and really, really sort of get into it. But at the same time, I want to design a movie that we can do on this low budget without it looking cheesy. So I don't want to do something grandiose. And they were like, well, okay, so we have this plot, we have this one-line thing that maybe would work for you. A group of refugees from Earth have to survive on a hostile alien planet. That was the only requirement. I could do anything as long as it fit that one-sentence description. And I was like, yes, I'll do that. And that became a film called A.E., which I didn't know at the time was their mockbuster for After Earth. But it once again, I had no knowledge of the studio film. Mm-hmm. And so I started, and so at that point I had already agreed to do the giant monster movie. So what happened then was now I had two projects going at the same time. So I called a friend of mine who was a huge Godzilla fan, a huge monster movie fan. And basically he and I were going to collaborate on the giant monster movie. He was going to do the bulk of the work, and I would just sort of polish it and make sure it was professional and acceptable for the asylum, while I focused on A.E. And so I was working on A.E. when they came to me like a month later, and they said, you know, forget about Sharkstorm. What we really want you to do is Sharknado. And I said, what do sharks have to do with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization? And I heard Sharknado. Uh-huh. And he said, no, Sharknado, a tornado full of sharks. And I said, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of. And if I can do it that way, I'm in. And
what was the difference between Sharkstorm and Sharknado?
Well, Sharkstorm was going to be played straight, and Sharknado sounded so ridiculous that there was no way they could play it straight. Mm-hmm. And apparently what had happened, I didn't know this at the time, but what had happened is that the Asylum wanted to do a movie called Sharkstorm, and Sci-Fi had this title, Sharknado, which was from a line in another one of their movies. And they wanted to do a movie called Sharknado. And so they had their monthly meeting. At that point, Sci-Fi and Asylum were having monthly meetings. And they each mentioned these projects. And, you know, Sci-Fi said, we want to do a movie called Sharkstorm. And Asylum said, we want to do a movie called Sharkstorm. And Sci-Fi said, well, that's great, but call it Sharknado. And so by the time it got to me, Sci-Fi had already weighed in and given some notes on it. And the part of those notes that allowed me to feel like I could do it was when Sci-Fi said, obviously any movie called Sharknado is going to have humor in it. Because the Asylum is famous for taking their campy movies very seriously, playing them absolutely straight. And I knew if we were making a movie called Sharknado, it had to be done with a wink and a nod, sort of. Mm-hmm. And so I wrote Sharknado and had great fun with it, was attached to direct it. But by the time I finished the first draft, I realized that I'd written a script for a $100 million film. And maybe there was a way I could do it for $20 million, but I didn't see any way to do it for $1 million. And so I was like, I'm not sure how to do this on this budget. And at the same time, I was developing the idea, the treatment for AE. And it looked like they were going to be scheduled to be shot at the same time. And so I chose AE to direct.
Uh-huh. And how did AE turn out?
I loved it. We went off to the jungles of Costa Rica for 2 months, and I made a science fiction film, an actual science fiction film with science fiction concepts, and I got to do some good action stuff, and I got to do some interesting ideas, I thought, and it only called for visual effects that I knew would be very easy to do. And I think it's a very good little movie. Mm-hmm. It didn't get a lot of attention, but I'm very proud of it.
Okay, good.
And the critics who did review it certainly compared it favorably to After Earth. Mm-hmm. I don't think there was a single review of AE that didn't mention that it was better than After Earth. And I just really like it. Uh-huh. And I got to sort of do stuff as a director with it.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about your writing process just for a minute. Typically, when you get one of these assignments, you've got that, flushed out 3 to 4 page outline. How long does it then take you to write up the full script?
Well, it depends on when the deadline is, because that's how long it takes. Uh-huh. On 200 miles per hour, they approved the outline, said, this is great, we want you to go write the script, there's just one catch. We need it in 12 days. And at that point, I'd never written a script in less than 2 months before, because I'd always been writing on spec and just writing at my own pace. And usually a script would take me about 2 months. And they wanted it in 12 days. And what was worse is that this was near the end of the year, and I already had a Christmas party that I was throwing scheduled for 2 days later. And I knew I had to clean my apartment, and I had to buy food, and I had to decorate, and I had to do all this stuff. So by the time I actually got started on the script, I actually only had 10 days to write it. And so basically I just sort of chained myself to my computer, and I worked for 10 hours straight for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, I had a first draft. Uh-huh. That's not how I'd recommend doing it. But it was an interesting trial by fire, because I'd never written a script nearly that fast. And it proved to me that I could do it. So on the next film, when I had a month, and I really wanted 2 months, I knew I could get it done in a month. Mm-hmm. Sharknado, I actually had a lot of time, because they hadn't even put it in the schedule when I started writing it. And apparently they were known. I had been warned while I was doing American Warships, I had been warned that the development process with these co-productions with Sci-Fi was torturous and could go on forever, because the execs at Asylum would have very different notes from the execs at Sci-Fi. And so you'd satisfy one set of notes, and then the other company would not like it. And so you would address their notes, and then the first company, and it would go back and forth. And the guy who was producing American Warships had also worked on one of the Sci-Fi co-productions, and it had taken 2 years before the script was approved.
Jeez.
And so I was rather nervous about that. But then, actually, when I wrote the first draft of Sharknado, the Asylum had some notes for me, which was basically take out all this humor. And I was like, okay, but it's called Sharknado. And if Sci-Fi comes back and says it needs to be funnier, I'm going to get out a big cartoon hammer and hit you all over the heads with it. And so I took out all the humor, and they approved it, and the script went off to Sci-Fi. And Sci-Fi had a few minor notes and one major note. And the major note was, this should be funnier. Huh. So I put all the humor back in, and I addressed their notes. And that was basically it. There were a few more minor notes from people, but the Asylum's director of development said that this was the quickest script process they had ever had with sci-fi, and it was approved probably within a month, I bet, of my first draft being turned in.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
But it still wasn't on the schedule, and so the script just sat while I then started concentrating on writing AE. And so just before I was going to go off to Costa Rica for pre-production, they said, hey, we need you to take another pass at Sharknado because it's kind of a $200 million film right now. So I did a quick production polish on Sharknado before I went off to the jungle, but really it was still a $100 million film, and so it was up to Anthony Ferrante, the director, to figure out how to make it. And in fact, he ended up changing quite a bit, especially in the first half hour, just to make it doable.
I'm curious. I want to go back on something you said earlier, that basically you struggled for 20 years and then finally broke in. What did you do to support yourself during these 20 years? Just continue to do production jobs, still photographer, that kind of stuff, or did you have some other career?
I had a variety of day jobs, most of which I've now blocked out of my memory. And I spent a long time doing corporate promotional videos. Which was kind of a trap because it paid pretty well, and I was still directing, so I was sort of getting my fix. And I remember there was this one company that I'd been doing videos for I don't know, a year or two, and I was doing a whole series of promotional videos for this company, so I was actually working in their office, and they'd set up a little mini office for me within their larger space, their facility. And it was me and an assistant editor. And so I was pretty much a one-man shop. I would write the promo videos, I'd cast them, I'd direct them, I'd produce them. I'd hire a production crew for the days we were actually shooting. But then I'd edit them with this assistant editor, and this went on for a couple of years, I guess. And during this whole time, I had put up a mock-up poster of this film I wanted to raise money for and make. This was before Mutant Vampire Zombies. It was a science fiction film called The Man in the Machine. It was about this robot that basically went insane. And terrorized these two people whose spaceship had crash landed. And I had created this mock-up poster as inspiration, and I put it up on the wall in this little cubicle at this company that made toupees, men's hair replacements. And so here I was making these videos about toupees, and I remember one day we were waiting for something to render because this was the late 90s and it took half an hour for a 1-second dissolve to render on your nonlinear editing system. And I remember sitting there and looking up at that poster and realizing that it had been on the wall for over a year and I hadn't done anything to make that film happen. And so that was kind of a wake-up call for me, that it was time to that I'd been going down the wrong track for a while. And so right then and there, I started researching business plans for independent films and started trying to figure out how to put together financing. And I spent a couple of years trying to get that film made, and I was not able to, in the end, raise enough money to make it. But that process is what then allowed us, having already done that once, is what then allowed us to, in pretty short order, put together the business and raise the money to do Mutant Vampire Zombies from the Hood. Once I had that script that could be done on a lower budget.
Yeah. Sometimes it is. It's those failures that actually help you with your successes. I'm curious. I mean, Sharknado, it is this sort of cultural phenomenon, and I'm curious how that has impacted your career as a screenwriter. Has it gotten you meetings? Has it gotten you some writing assignments?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was, it took me 20 years to be an overnight success, as they say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, it's changed so much, and yet it hasn't changed. It's not like Steven Spielberg is calling me up and hiring me to, to direct his next movie. It's not it's not like Marvel has hired me for Guardians of the Galaxy. Even though, if you ask me, Guardians of the Galaxy is really no different than Sharknado, except it's got a much bigger budget. It's still the same sort of tongue-in-cheek tone. It's still the same sense of fun, the same campiness. So I don't know why they haven't called me for Guardians of the Galaxy. It hasn't happened yet. The big difference is it got me an agent. The night that Sharknado blew up, and the subsequent 3 or 4 days, was by far the most surreal experience in my life. But as it was all happening, the one thought in my head was, okay, this is it. This is your big break. And if you don't capitalize on it, you're never going to get another one, because things like this, if you're very lucky, come along once in a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
Who could have thought that this ridiculous little shark movie was going to take off like this? So my main goal coming out of it was that I had to get myself a good agent, because the agent is the key to the business. It's the key that unlocks the doors. And for a long time, the agents controlled the industry. It's not quite that way anymore. Not like in the days in the 80s and 90s, in the days of the super agents, Bernie Brillstein and what have you. But that was my main goal, was to get a good agent. Mm-hmm. And so as it was blowing up, I was reaching out to all the well-placed contacts I had. I knew a vice president at New Line, or a guy who had been vice president at New Line, and I knew a guy who had been president of the WB and who was now an independent producer, and I knew a couple of people who had been showrunners on successful series. But I had just made contacts over the last 20 years. Some of them I'd gotten to know fairly well. And, in the past I'd asked them for recommendations, but every time you recommend somebody to an agent, you're putting your reputation on the line. And it had always been a very awkward thing, and they never really, I think, felt comfortable doing that for me until Sharknado blew up. And when I called them the next day after Sharknado blew up and said, hey, this has happened, I really need to take advantage of it. Can you refer me to an agent? Now they were willing to do that. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I was thinking of in those first few days was I got to get all the publicity out of this that I can. And my cousin, who had once done PR for Nike, called me up and said, this is amazing. What are you doing to take advantage of it? And I said, well, I'm trying to figure that out. And she said, well, you need a publicist. And I said, I can't afford a publicist. They're like $10,000 a month. I don't have that kind of money. And she said, here's what you should do. Go on Twitter and post something like, the broke writer of Sharknado needs publicist now. And that's what I did. Mm-hmm. And within an hour, I had a professional publicist who was willing to work on commission.
Huh, that's great.
And he started getting me interviews. I was on Good Morning America. This happened on a Friday, and the Sharknado blew up Thursday night. On Friday, I did the Twitter post. By the end of the day, I had a publicist, and by Saturday, he had arranged for me to be interviewed on Good Morning America, amongst many, many other places. I was on CNN, I was on MSNBC, I was on all these things. And while he went to the CNN interview with me, and while we were in the green room, we were just talking, getting to know each other, because it was the first time we'd actually met in person. We'd just been talking on the phone and stuff.
Uh-huh.
And I said, the main thing I want to get out of this is I want to get an agent. And he says, well, I just happen to know an agent at the Gersh agency. Let me contact him for you. And he made the call, and they talked for a minute. He said, he wants to read the Sharknado script. I said, okay. So I sent him over my original script, not what had actually finally been shot, but my original script. And apparently he wanted to make sure that I hadn't written this thinking it was a good, serious movie. He wanted to make sure that I actually understood what I was writing, and that I was in on the joke.
Uh-huh.
And once he read my actual script, he called me for a meeting. And I went in and met with him the very next day. And I was prepared to pitch him, to convince him to represent me. And he spent the whole lunch trying to convince me to let him represent me.
Huh.
And I had heard very good things about the Gersh agency. Whenever I would always ask people who had representation if they liked their agent or not.
Mm-hmm.
And the only ones who were universally happy with their agents were people at Gersh. And so when he offered to represent me, I said, yeah, let's do it.
The last thing I like to do, just to wrap things up, is just get, anything you feel comfortable sharing, like a Twitter feed or a Facebook page or a blog, just something so people can maybe follow along with kind of what you're doing.
Sure. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/ThunderLevinOfficial. And I'm on Twitter at ThunderLevin. Okay,
perfect. And I'll get all that stuff and get that into the show notes. So what's next for you? What are you working on now?
Well, I'm working on, 2 TV movies, both of which are top secret at the moment, but one of which I'm sure you could guess at. And I am in the process of pitching 2 TV series. One of which is called Dive, and it's sort of a Sharknado-esque, tongue-in-cheek science fiction series. I guess I would describe it as Star Trek meets One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in a submarine. And then I'm also pitching a serious apocalyptic TV series, which is called As We Know It.
Huh. All right. Well, sounds like you have a lot going on. Once again, Thunder, I really appreciate your coming on. The Sharknado has definitely been something that came on my radar. I remember when I first saw the first trailer for it, I thought, is this even real? I thought maybe someone had just made this trailer as some sort of a joke. I've watched it with my daughter, my young daughter. She's 5 years old. We've watched the movies and she loves them.
Right.
So I've really enjoyed them. So again, I really appreciate your coming on.
Sure. Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Thank you. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
I just want to mention 2 things I'm doing at Selling Your Screenplay to help screenwriters find producers who are looking for material. First, I've created a monthly newsletter that will be sent directly to producers. Every member of SYS Select can submit 1 log line per newsletter. I went and emailed my large database of producers and asked them if they would like to receive this monthly newsletter of pitches. So far, I have well over 200 producers who have signed up to receive it. These producers are hungry for material and happy to read scripts from new writers. So if you want to participate in this pitch newsletter and get your scripts into the hands of lots of producers, sign up at sellingyourscreenplayselect.com. And secondly, I partnered with one of the premier paid screenwriting leads sites so I can syndicate their leads to SYS Select members. There are lots of great leads coming in each week from our partner. Recently, I've been getting 10 to 12 high-quality leads per week. These are producers and production companies who are actively looking for material. or are actively looking to hire a screenwriter for a specific project that they're developing. If you sign up for SYS Select, you'll get these leads emailed directly to you several times per week, and these emails that I'm sending out will have direct contact to the producers, so there's no proxy between, you know, selling your screenplay and these producers. You will get direct contact information. You'll be able to email them, or in some cases, I think, call them directly. These leads run the gamut from production companies looking for spec scripts to producers looking to hire a screenwriter to write up one of their ideas or write up a particular, maybe a novel or something that they have optioned. There are leads for short films, features, producers looking for TV and web series pilots. It's a huge array of different types of projects. And again, these are our premium leads. So for the most part, these are paid leads. They may not be obviously for writing a short, you're not necessarily going to make a lot of money, but these producers do have some budget to hire writers. So they are professional credits. As I said, paid screenwriting leads. So if you want to learn more about that, definitely check out SYS Select. You can sign up by going to sellingyourscreenplayselect.com. You'll learn more on that page as well. I recently set up a success stories page. I get a lot of emails asking, hey, how do people do with your blast? Hey, how do people do with these leads? Go and check that out if you're curious, just to see what some other writers are doing with these leads and with the email and fax blast service that I offer. It's sellingyourscreenplay.com/success, and you can read a whole bunch of success stories. If you've had some success with the SYS services, please do email me. I'd love to add you to the success stories page and perhaps even have you on for an interview on the podcast. These success stories are very inspirational. It's great to share your story and tell other people kind of how you got started, how you broke in, how you made your first few dollars as a screenwriter. So if you've had some success, please do give me, just drop me a line. Drop me an email. So in the next episode of the podcast, I'm going to be interviewing Shaun Baker and Critch Burgach, who wrote the film Tangerine. It's a real art house film about transvestite prostitutes working in Hollywood. It was shot here in LA using a lot of non-actors. It was shot on an iPhone, so it's a real interesting film to watch. It's a cool story, but it's also just, if you hear sort of the behind the scenes, it's a real interesting story. And eventually this film did make it to Sundance as well. So I'm interviewing these two writers next week, so keep an eye out for that episode. To wrap things up, I just want to touch on a few things from today's interview with Thunder. I really hope people are getting some value out of these podcasts. You know, there was so many great bits of inspiration and tactical advice that I think Thunder gave us. So I just want to touch on a couple of things that stood out to me, but I really think the whole interview was just chock full of just great, interesting advice to screenwriters. A couple things that really stood out to me: the 20-year hustle that Thunder went through. Really pay attention to this. I mean, he was networking, he was writing, he was directing infomercials, commercials, and infomercials for nearly 2 decades. This is important. Working as a director is great experience, just learning how to run production and how to shoot stuff. So I think obviously if you can work your way up and get into a point where you're writing and directing commercials, that's a great training ground for feature films. I think it's just really interesting too. He constantly was pushing his scripts out there and constantly failing. He had some near misses, and anybody who's in this business for any length of time can tell you that that's really just sort of part of how things go. And I try not to, on the podcast, try not to talk about things until something is like some contract is signed. But these things are going on. With me all the time. You get people emailing you. They read your script. Oh, we're going to go make this movie. Yeah, I love it. I've got financing in place. Let's go. And then things kind of peter out for whatever reason. And the story that Thunder says, it sounds very specific. To him, how this guy died and things didn't quite work out. But those. I never had that exact thing happen to me, but those are the sorts of things that happen. Just things can go wrong, and you just never can, until the money's in the bank, you can never really count on. Until that contract is signed, you really can never quite tell what's going to happen. So you've got to keep a lot of irons in the fire. You've got to keep a lot of things going so that hopefully one of them actually does take off. And I think it's interesting, too, that ultimately what really got him ahead as a writer and a director was shooting his own low-budget indie film. Again, he was able to really take some of his working experience as a commercial director and wrap that into his love for fiction films, for feature films. And that's a great way he was able to leverage a lot of his skills and a lot of his interests together. I've talked about this before on the podcast. I think that's a great 1-2 combination. Working in the industry, having some sort of an industry job, even if it's not as a director of commercials, working in the industry and also, going out and making things happen for yourself. Time and time again, people on the podcast that I've interviewed come up with that. Obviously, working in the industry is a great thing to do. You make a lot of connections, but you've also, in your spare time, you've got to be writing scripts, and you've got to be just trying to push your scripts ahead and get those scripts out there. And in Thunder's case, just going out there and making an indie film, even all the while working a full-time job doing commercials. And these are long hours, so it's not like Thunder just had lots of money, wealthy parents, and could sit around and do this indie film. I mean, doing commercials and working in that infomercial space, it's grueling hours. You can be on the set a lot. There's a lot of prep work, a lot of production, a lot of post-production. It's not typically super high paid. It's good experience, but the people that do these, it's very much sort of the blue-collar job of filmmaking, doing these infomercials. So it's a great experience, but it's not like Thunder was making, millions of dollars doing it. He had to, at some point, just go home from work when he was exhausted and start writing that script and spend his weekends. He didn't go to the beach. He sat down and he wrote these scripts and started to push them forward. And that's just what it's going to take. But I think it's a great 1-2 combination, working in the industry and then also working to push your projects ahead. When I started SYS, this was many, many years ago when it was just a blog, but long before the podcast. I remember actually reading a forum post about my blog. Some people had read some of my blog posts, and I think the specific post they were talking about was, it was basically someone was saying, well, gee, how long should it take me to break in? And I was telling them it could take, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, or even more years to break in. I mean, we just heard Thunder's story, 2 decades of beating his head against the wall. And the people in this forum were basically saying, oh, this guy, Ashley Scott Myers, he's such a Debbie Downer. It's just so depressing to read his stuff. And I don't find it depressing, and perhaps that's why I don't mind talking about it, is to me, hearing Thunder's story is very inspirational, and I hope the people listening to this podcast find it inspirational as well. I mean, he's a really cool guy. He's finally worked hard and kind of got what, was coming to him after all these years, so I think that's great. But it's a fairly, it's not easy, but it's fairly straightforward. And I think it's going to take a lot of work. Like, it's a lot of work, but it's fairly straightforward. And I think that's what I like about hearing these types of stories is, I hope anyways, I don't listen to Thunders. I guess at some point there is a little bit of luck in the Sharknado thing sort of really took off, and you can't really predict those things. But him getting to that point, even if Sharknado hadn't been this huge cultural phenomenon, he still would have been basically there writing scripts professionally, directing feature films professionally, and doing this stuff. That was kind of the icing on the cake. And I think it's really worth noting. It's a 20-year slog for him. And I don't think as I said, I don't think it's depressing. I think it's encouraging. Maybe you can do it quicker if you're super talented or get super lucky or some combination of the two. I think it definitely can happen much, much quicker. But I think for most people, this is the sort of effort that it's going to take. Is it worth the effort, 20-year slog to eventually write Sharknado? That's a question only you can answer for yourself. But I do think realistically that's what it's going to take. Again, unless you're super duper talented or super duper lucky or some combination of the two, I think this is sort of the reality of what the entertainment industry is. And as I said, it's a lot of work, but if you're not afraid of doing hard work, it is pretty straightforward. I hope, too, you watch Sharknado with some new appreciation. I remember reading a review of a film that I wrote and helped produce, a movie called Man Overboard. This was back in 2008, and I remember we were being real aggressive, sending DVDs out to blogs. We were trying to generate a bunch of reviews, and this one film site just absolutely bashed our film. And but part of the review, I remember, like, the first paragraph was, well, people are making these movies and this movie is crappy, and but I guess everyone just made a little bit of money and so they're moving on. And it's like, he missed the point. Like, nobody made a lot of money on that movie. Everybody that worked on it was working for very little money and was really doing it just because they thought it was a cool project. And something like Sharknado, a lot of people just laugh it off, but when you really dig down into the story of the people who made it, a guy like Thunder, there's a pretty interesting story there. And I'd like to think my films, there's a story, even if some of these films that I've made are terrible, they get terrible reviews and in different places, people, rip into them. There is a story behind them, and keep that in mind as you go through with your own career. Even the silliest movies do have a story, an interesting story behind them, and there is quite a bit of just skill and hard work that goes into them. Anyway, that's the show. Thank you for listening.